Cultural influences on conflict management. How do we learn how to deal with conflict? Who teaches us how to solve conflicts when they arise? And before we answer this, do you know the style of conflict negotiators that best describe you? How do you deal with conflict? And where do you think that comes from with how you have dealt with it before? Let's learn more about this on page 237. The first thing to take into account is family influences. It is largely responsible from the family background of how you were learned while growing up how to deal with conflict. They say the ways people respond to conflict could be influenced by their cultural background, they deal with it while they're learning while they're growing up. And the conflict resolution strategies are related to how people manage their self-image in relationships. Do you preserve your own self-esteem, then help other people, a person, say, face? Or do you sacrifice your own self-esteem to preserve the relationship? We tend to prefer a particular conflict style, and this is largely influenced by our family backgrounds. Some families prefer a certain conflict style, and therefore as children we accept that style as normal. If your parents are used to not talking at all during a fight, then most likely in a relationship you would think that that's a conflict style you would use. If your family is someone that fights all the time and shouts at each other, you might see that as normal. Your family might prefer a direct then or an indirect approach. Families believe that in terms of conflict, a direct approach is more healthy than an indirect approach. Our next section looks at intercultural conflict styles and the different sort of styles you would use while you're in conflict with someone. So that's quite interesting. Let's look at this. The discussion style. This is a verbally direct approach where you mean what you say and you say what you mean. The people who use this style are comfortable expressing disagreements directly to the person and prefer to keep their emotions restrained. You don't involve your emotions or your personal feelings into the discussion, mostly used by Europeans, Australians, and New Zealanders. Restraint in expressions underlies this style. So is this you? When you fight with someone, do you prefer to just say exactly the fight as it is? You did this wrong, I should have done this, but you did this, and you keeping your emotions out of it is the idea. So you're going to say exactly what had happened and sort of cut to the chase. A verbally direct and confrontational approach, which is intense verbal and also non-verbal expressions of emotion. That is to say that you sort of have a mixture of both here. So this would be the engagement style, where we're dealing with both the verbally direct and confrontational approach. So here it has been linked to African Americans and South Europeans, France, Greece, Italy, and so on. This approach is captured by a Russian proverb, which is after storm, fair weather, after sorrow, joy. The next one is an accommodating style. Now we're moving away from direct approach and we're moving into indirect approach. You're going to keep your emotions restrained, and people use this style very ambiguous and indirect in expressing their views. This style is they use the style to ensure conflict does not get out of control, used by Latin Americans, Mexicans, Costa Ricans, and so on. Silence produces peace, and peace produces safety, is the proverbs used here. Or the first to raise their voice loses the argument. So in this case, you are restraining your emotions, and silence and avoidance is used here to manage the conflict. The example they give in the textbook is the Amish would prefer to lose face or money rather than escalate a conflict. An Amish children are instructed to turn the other cheek in any conflict situation. So this might be you. When it comes to conflict, is your your preferred approach to sort of leave the room, avoid, give the silent treatment? Remember, it's just an approach. There's no one that's better than the other. It's just sort of technique that you might use, a style. So when you are in conflict, do you prefer just not to talk about it and sort of avoid the conflict and keep your emotions restrained? In this case, because conflict could occur, sometimes intermediaries are the best solution to deal with the conflict, which is someone that can step in your behalf and say your side of the story. And therefore, the use of mediation can happen in formal settings. Our last one is dynamic style, which is more emotionally intense and expressive using strong language and that elaborated style of talking with metaphors and also third-party intermediaries. This is when you're comfortable with emotional confrontational talk. There's a degree of emotional expressiveness used by Arabs in the Middle East. Our last part of this section is talking about the cautions of stereotyping. Now, as I've been talking about this section, you might have noticed I said, Arabs do this, Europeans do this, Asian cultures do this, but we need to be very careful that just because it's been applied in the textbook as a generalization of their culture, that we shouldn't stereotype that a group would have that certain style. In this section, they say that cultural differences can depend on many factors, such as the regions historically being homogeneous and isolated from other cultures, the influence of colonization, and none of the styles dominate the other in South Africa. Our next section looks at managing intercultural conflict. Let's get started.